Hello,
Oh,
good
have you seen?
afternoon. Today our guest is Professor Stephen Baskerville. Hello, Stephen. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you. Good to be here.
Yes, it's a pleasure to speak to you, Stephen. Stephen, I've been following your works for some time. You contribute to Chronicles magazine, and years ago you wrote a piece for the National Humanities Institute. Stephen, whenever we discuss modern culture, we often critique the demise of the family or the ascent of sexual politics, but you look at it from a different angle. The state is intruding into the family. What do you mean by this?
Oh, very much so. There's an awful lot of lamenting and bemoaning by conservatives about the decline of the family and the power of the culture. But my argument is that the culture is important, but we're far beyond that. It's now the power of the state. And there's many ways that the state interferes directly in the family, but the most serious of all, in my view, is the curtailment of parental rights, the invasion, the abrogation of parental rights by government officials. And by that, I mean, especially family court judges,
Yes.
social workers. The most notorious, the most serious of all venues is the divorce arena. The divorce, that's by far the most serious, but there's others as well. The child protective services, and so other ways can invade the parental rights of not only divorcing parents, but also intact families.
And Stephen, are you being polemical when you say that there is a war on men? Because I agree with you, and I do not believe that it is a polemic. The evidence is overwhelming, both for America and in places in the developing world.
Yes, absolutely. I don't think there's any question about that. In my writings, I try not to talk about a war on men. I try not to talk about the devaluation of men so much, because I think by far the most important of all, the most important aspect of this, the most important example of this is the destruction of fatherhood. And the impact of that is not just on men, and it's not just on fathers, it's on children, and it's on the entire society is paying the cost of this. So this is much more broad and much more important than just men's rights or the unfairness to men, or these cliches that we hear. This is a very serious attack on masculinity and fatherhood itself, and we all pay the price.
So, for example, in Spike magazine, there's a pretty old article published in 2010, April 2010, and the title is Turning Parents into Partners of the State. And I think that the title is even more relevant today because there are so many examples of children being taken away from their parents because the state assumes that they're not being raised properly. The issue has exploded since then.
Absolutely. It is. If anything, the problem is getting worse since I wrote my books. And now there's new rationalizations for seizing control of children. And that's the COVID virus. I've come across recently many examples from the CDC and other government agencies. They're developing rationalizations to seize people's children if they have not been vaccinated. So this kind of thing is developing all the time. New justifications, new rationalizations to seize control of people's children. It's very, very dangerous. And the reason we're seeing this today, I might add, is because we have neglected it in the past.
Yes, and Stephen, in the article you wrote for the National Humanities Institute, I cited that piece when I was interviewing Jeff Degner, and you referenced a judge who basically said that the legal system doesn't really care about the rights of men. I remember the statements quite accurately, and the product was that men are not that important.
Well, that's very true. That's very true.
Yes, you wrote this article years ago.
That's right. It sounds like something.
Yes.
I would write. But it's more important than just men. It's also today we're seeing. I mean, if you look at Afghanistan, we're seeing the consequences in many ways of the devaluation of masculinity, manhood, fatherhood in our society.
But masculinity is important. Just recently, I saw a study saying that women are not likely to select cat men for partners because women like masculine partners, and own a cat may be indicative of femininity. So masculinity is important. And the editor of Chronicles, Annie, was on the show, and we discussed a study she cited, noting that children like it when their fathers are masculine. And there's also research showing that when men become parents, their brains are designed to ensure that they strategize more effectively. Hence, they're more masculine and serious, whereas women nurture. The maternal instinct and the instinct to nurture is actually wired into the biology of women, according to research done by Japanese scientists some years ago. So masculinity is very important.
Absolutely. And it's important to almost all women as well. We hear in the media the voices of feminists and extremists to the contrary. But the fact of the matter is that people do not respect men if they're not masculine and if they're not manly. And that's why I urge men not just to that acting more like women and acting more feminine and so forth. This is not the solution to the problem. The solution is to hold the line and fulfill your masculine calling. That's right.
Yes, Stephen, and fathers, how important are these creatures? Because this is how they're perceived by many.
Absolutely. Oh, fathers are very important. I show in my books, in fact, that fatherhood is almost synonymous with civilization. That civilized society is a society with families and with fathers. In the State of Nature, philosopher Thomas Hobbes wrote that in the state of nature, the dominion over children is in the mother. The single mother home is a return to the state of nature. It's a return to uncivilized society. And we can see this in the huge social pathologies and social problems that develop from single mother homes. It's only with the advent of the father, with the inclusion, the development of the father, that a true family exists. And it's only with that a true civilization exists.
And Stephen, years ago, a writer, I believe his name is Gilmore, he contends that patriarchal societies are correlated with civilization, and societies that do not become a patriarchy are rarely civilized societies, in the sense that they don't have complex political structures. Some may caution us against taking his word at face value, but as someone who's really interested in studying personality differences, racial differences, and country differences, I do agree with him. Traits that are required to make civilization wealthy, like competition, individualism, risk tolerance, are more concentrated in men than in women. So, for example, women are more likely to conform than men. And this is one reason why studies show that women are more supportive of anti-COVID measures.
That's very true. Yes, I don't remember Gilmore's all of his reasoning on that, but I think basically, in a broad sense, he's very correct. Yes.
Yes, so now, Stephen, men are important and women are important. It's important to have women working as nurturers. For years, studies have been showing that children will do well in a stable family, and it is also crucial that women play a role in nurturing children. So, for example, stay-at-home moms, their children are more likely to attend elite schools, and this study was reported by the Federalist magazine. So the traits of men and women complement each other, but we cannot emphasize some traits and de-emphasize others. We like nurturers, but at the end of the day, for civilization to really advance, it must be undergirded by risk takers and overconfident men.
That's very true. Yes, yes. The mother-child bond is essentially is biological in many ways. It's hardwired. It's undeniable. It's the father-child bond that's always problematic, but it's also essential because it involves achievement and the other qualities which you indicated. It's not a purely biological connection. It involves conscious effort on the part of not only the man and the child, but also the entire civilization to create and preserve that bond, that fatherhood bond, and the authority that comes with it. And without that, we lose, I think, an essential feature of our civilization.
Yeah, so for example, the Center for Social Justice, apparently it's somewhat on the left. The center argues children who experience family breakdown were twice as likely to fail at school. Stephen, you have written on the topic. I have discussed the topic. Right now, we're discussing the issue. But why are some people just refusing to acknowledge the primacy of the family? The family is really important.
Absolutely, yes.
You may go ahead.
Right. Well, actually, my complaint, though, is more, you're right. I mean, there are those on the left, especially who do refuse to simply acknowledge that. And it's nice to see that some on the left do acknowledge this importance of the family. In my writings, though, and especially my articles and chronicles, my complaint is more with the right, because what I find, and it's very frustrating, is that conservatives do acknowledge this importance, the importance of the family, the importance of fatherhood, the terrible problems that come with the breakdown of fatherhood. And yet conservatives look the other way as government officials destroy fatherhood and destroy families and destroy marriages. And again, I'm talking primarily about the divorce machinery, but also the child protective services. These services, they destroy people's homes, fathers and sometimes mothers who have done nothing legally wrong, find their children taken away from them permanently sometimes, and even themselves plundered and incarcerated without trial. And conservatives look the other way as this happens. They've done nothing over the years to call attention to this, to end it, to reform it. And this is extremely frustrating because conservatives do acknowledge the importance of fatherhood, the importance of the family, and yet they support these policies, they support these government officials who are actively destroying families.
So let me read a snippet from your article, Stephen. Social workers, lawyers, judges, and others had a strong pecuniary interest in demonizing fathers and using children to rationalize their power and earnings. They were simply too strong to bother quibbling about justice. Young Black fathers were forced to finance the filching of their own children. Attorney Jed Abram wrote in From Courtship to Courtroom.
Absolutely, that's exactly what I'm talking about. And this is an extremely serious problem. It shows why it's not simply the culture. This is not simply cultural pressures like rock music or pornography. It's much more serious than that. These government officials have a vested interest, a bureaucratic interest, a pecuniary interest, a political interest in destroying families. And in my articles and in my books, I describe and document precisely how this works, these conflicts of interest, this corruption, these horrible incentives that are created in the state to actively destroy families. You can't put a pretty face on it.
Yes, and Stephen, you also critique the concept of no-fault divorce. What have been some of the consequences of this pernicious law? No-fault divorce, why is it bad?
Well, the obvious consequence of the no-fault divorce, right? No-fault divorce. Well, the obvious consequence is that it destroys families and creates fatherless children for the reasons that we've already discussed. But it does even more than that. It destroys our civil liberties. It destroys the constitutional system. And in my books and articles, I go down the list of the Bill of Rights, the US Bill of Rights, and other guarantees of civil rights and civil liberties, human rights. And I show how the involuntary divorce or forced divorce destroys basic civil liberties. So it's not just children, it's not just fathers, it's the entire society. If you destroy the rights of one group of people, you can destroy everybody's rights. It creates a precedent which justifies, rationalizes destroying everyone's rights. So the cost of all of this is not just in social pathologies and the enormous financial costs that go with them, but also the breakdown of our constitutional protections, our constitutional system of government. And it's extremely serious. And I think in many ways, since the election, we've seen the broader consequences of this and how the failure to confront this in one sector of society inevitably allows it to spread to other sectors of society.
Remember, Stephen, marriage was created as a sacrament in Western civilization by the Roman Catholic Church. Marriage is not just a contract, it is a philosophical institution. Therefore, it ought to be quite difficult to renounce a marriage. And this is what no-fault divorce has done. It makes it easy to dissolve marriage, thereby making the institution trivial.
Absolutely, yes. Many people point out that marriage is more than just a contract. It's for most people, it's a sacred religious covenant. But the protection that marriage has is even less than other contracts, not more. Other contracts, and again, the Constitution of the United States requires that contracts must be honored and must be enforced. And yet the marriage contract is not enforced. Not only is it not enforced by state courts, but it is torn up. It is abrogated by this very government officials that should be enforcing it. So it's a again, this is only one of many direct violations of the U.S. Constitution that no-fault divorce allows. As I say in my article, no-fault justice is a contradiction in terms. You cannot have no-fault justice.
Yes, Stephen. And Stephen, there's another issue that you touched on, and most people often ignore it: the myth of the deadbeat dad. Obviously, some men do abandon their children, but there's a deeper issue. So, for example, in Jamaica, some scholars write that women are unlikely to allow access to children if the man is poor. So even if the man is willing to be a nurturer, if he's not wealthy, he's often avoided and ignored. And you also share this view to an extent, as you discussed in your article. Some fathers do want to step up, but the legal system is making it prohibitive to do so.
Well, that's very true. Yes, the child support enforcement system is a negative incentive. It's a horrible incentive. It exacerbates, it makes the system much worse than it otherwise is. Again, many people have misconceptions about child support enforcement. They think it's intended to provide for children who have been abandoned by their fathers. This is a tiny amount of it, percentage of it. Overwhelmingly, it creates incentives to remove the father from the home. And it is incentive for the mother to divorce, is an incentive for the state officials to encourage divorce. In other words, it's an incentive. It's a subsidy on divorce. And it creates much more of it, and on single parent homes generally. And the child support system is another example of the unconstitutional criminalization of innocent parents. And I mean innocent parents. It's very documentable. There's no contradiction between enforcing child support on those few fathers who really do abandon their children and reforming the child support system so it's no longer a system of plundering and criminalizing innocent fathers.
As you write, Stevens, federal subsidies on child support collections make divorce and single mother homes enormously profitable for state governments, incentivizing them to encourage as much divorce and create as many fatherless children as possible. Again,
Yes.
economics is important. If you're a divorce attorney, you will support these laws. Why? Because they're lining your pockets with money. And what do
Yes.
bureaucrats want? Bureaucrats want power, and they want jobs and also money. And regulations create an incentive for bureaucrats to secure more funding.
Absolutely. And absolutely. And the child support system is the worst I've ever seen. I mean, in my entire career as a political scientist and a student of political and governmental affairs, I've never seen anything. It's precisely what we refer to as a kleptocracy. It's a government by thieves. Many people call the divorce and child support system a system of child kidnapping and extortion by government officials. And it's very hard to quarrel with that. That's precisely what it is.
Yes, and I'm happy that you're situating your ideas in the broader context of the assault on masculinity. So, for example, Stephen, I'm a libertarian, but personally I'm quite conservative. But as we discussed earlier, women like aggressive men, and there are women who would object to a man asking her if he can kiss her. But the Me Too movement has upended this dynamic. So, for example, there's a celebrity. He's an Indian celebrity. His name is not important at the moment. Maybe it is Aziz Ansari, something to that effect. This young man met a young lady, and apparently the sex was bad. She was not assaulted, the sex was just bad. And he was smeared as someone who specialized in harassing women.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. This is the important thing about the Me Too movement to realize, and people don't realize this. They learned their techniques from the divorce system. The rehearsal for all of that was the divorce system. That's where the false allegations of domestic violence were perfected, were honed. These techniques of railroading innocent men on false, knowingly, patently false accusations of crimes, all of this was developed in the divorce system. From there, it spread out into the universities with the rape accusations and sexual assault accusations in the universities. And from there, it spread to the mainstream politics with these sexual assault accusations against people like, Judge Kavanaugh and Bill Cosby. and others. And it's not to say that the men are not always, play their part, but it's not, what we're seeing here is the criminalization of the sexual revolution. It's the sexual revolution taken to its logical conclusion.
It's inverted.
Yeah. Right.
It's an inverted revolution, because on one hand, the feminists are saying women can have sex like men and be free, but in modern societies, they sound like Puritans.
Right. Well, this is the dynamic that I describe in my book, The New Politics of Sex. And I argue that there is, in the sexual revolution, like in other revolutions, like in the French Revolution, for example, or the Russian, there's always the promise of freedom. It starts out with the promise of freedom. You can have free sex, you can have sex without consequences, unlimited sexual freedom. But then the other side of it is the authoritarian side. The authoritarian side comes down, and the accusations, sexual assault, sexual abuse, rape, domestic violence, sexual this and sexual that. So there's always a correlation. There's the promise of freedom, like in the French Revolution. There was the rights of man, and then there was the reign of terror. And it's a similar kind of dynamic that we see on a more subtle level in the sexual revolution. It's first the promise of freedom and pleasure and joy and release, and then the axe comes down. Then comes the corollary, authoritarianism and even totalitarianism, with the criminalization of innocent people, or the criminalization of people who take the bait, so to speak. And it's primarily men, though sometimes it's also women.
Yes, and the movement is also hypocrisy. So Wendy McElroy has an article for Mises titled "Vawa Balkanizes Rights, Cynically Erasing Male Indians." And her thesis is that men are also victims of sexual abuse, but they are ignored by the justice system. So sexual abuse apparently is a problem, but if men are being sexually abused, we shouldn't discuss it.
That's true. Yes, many people do point this out nowadays, that men are also the victims of sexual assault, of sexual abuse, and so forth. I don't dwell on that in my work. I prefer to raise the larger issues, because I think there's much more serious issues than that involved, and that is the very concept of sexual abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence. It's an innovation in the legal system. It doesn't necessarily, if you look at the definitions of for example, domestic violence, it does not require that the violence, so-called violence, actually be violent. It does not have to be physical violence or the threat of physical violence. It can be verbal or psychological or economic. I mean, the idea of psychological violence or verbal violence, I mean, these are meaningless terms. They can be anything you want. Criminal law has to be precise. It has to be concrete. A jury has to know why they're being asked to send someone to prison, and they have to know. But these vague terms like sexual abuse and sexual misconduct, these don't. This is highly improper way to run a legal system. And this is what I mean. You cannot have a system of no fault justice. It means no fault justice means injustice.
And Stephen, I'm a serious person. If you violate someone's right, physically or otherwise, this matter should be adjudicated in the court. However, withholding technology from someone cannot be construed as abuse. I was reading PolicyBot once. So the Heartland Institute has a platform called PolicyBot, and there was an article contending that men can actually get into trouble for not sharing technology with women. So the concept of abuse is so broad that even refusing to give your wife money is an example of abuse.
Yeah, very much so. That's right. So again, another example of a government shakedown, right? Shaking down people for money and threatening them with an abuse accusation. It's a form of government-sponsored extortion. No, you're very right. There is no definition. These terms are just completely wide open, so that anything you do, if someone wants to prosecute you, they will find some way to fit some term or some category in which your behavior can be included, and so for which you can be incarcerated. So it's extremely. This threatens everybody's freedom. It threatens everybody's civil liberties to allow this kind of thing to happen to anyone.
It's just like the case of Ian Baruma. Ian Baruma's case is extremely revealing, and I'm so surprised that people don't belabor his dilemma more. Ian Baruma is a respected writer on the left. He's a specialist in the history of Japan. And I like to read the New York Review of Books, and Ian Baruma is fairly reasonable. Ian interviewed a man who was accused of harassment but exonerated, and Ian was fired.
Yes, I do remember that now. I agree with you. I enjoy his writings. I find them very insightful,
Yeah,
even though I don't agree with him. And that was outrageous. Yeah, and it's again evident of the abuse of power. Right?
It's just like law students who get upset when the professor says due process in rape is also important.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's amazing. And you're right. The rhetoric of the extremists, the rhetoric proves the case against them. I mean, you don't have to show how the justice is miscarried. They advocate the miscarriage of justice. They advocate extreme feminists, for example, complain that the rape conviction rate is too low. Well, this is effectively amounts to saying that they know that people that they don't know are guilty of crimes, that they know that someone is guilty of a crime even though they have no familiarity with the person or the case. And this is absolutely unacceptable in a free society. You're right. It's the rhetoric itself, the advocacy is proof of how power is being abused.
And the reality is so upsetting. So, for example, Ayan Urshi Ali has a new book on the subject matter. So she's arguing that feminists often ignore sexual abuse when it is perpetrated by non-whites. And this morning, I interviewed a guest and we discussed the issue that occurred in Germany some years ago where migrants assaulted women. And there's also another case where one lady she had a migrant in her care. It was reported by the Guardian, and he committed a crime, and she basically defended him. She was a white woman, so sexual abuse is egregious. It is bad. We should never abuse women. But if it is pursued by a migrant or someone who is not white, it is still a crime. Should it be a crime? We're heading in this direction.
Yeah. This is I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, and it is just so radical and crazy. So there are black feminists who like to complain about harassment, but if the perpetrator is a black man, they contend that the concept of harassment is a white feminist construct to depress black men.
Well, sometimes I think in some cases it is, but what you're illustrating there, what you're establishing is that the entire thing is not about justice. It's not about evidence. It's not about fact. It's not about legal standards. It's about politics. It's about power competing power between groups of people, whether it's racial groups or sexual groups or ethnic groups or whatever. We've discarded the concept, the standards, the objective standards of justice, and substituted the competition for power among groups.
So, Stephen, you have an interesting book titled The New Politics of Sex, The Sexual Revolution, Civil Liberties, and the Growth of Governmental Power. And we'll be talking about your book, but before we do so, tell us a little about feminism. How did feminism transform gender relations? And you can be brief. I'm not asking for a thesis.
Right. Well, that's what that book is about. And it shows the ironies, many ways, of feminism. It challenges some of the assumptions even of conservatives, because I think conservatives have been somewhat blind. Even the critics of feminism have been somewhat blind to its full potential. Again, there's a dynamic in feminism that needs to be examined, and the entire sexual revolution is taken further by transgenderists and homosexual activists. And again, feminism promises freedom. It promises equality. It promises good things that we can all have. It even promises men that they can be relieved of their responsibilities of masculinity and so forth. So it promises many good things, or seemingly good things. But then there's also an authoritarian side of feminism, which is wants to legislate new gender crimes. They want to eliminate the old restrictions on sex. They want to eliminate the religious, the traditional controls on sexuality. But that's only the first stage. They also want to impose then their own standards, their own rules, their own laws on sexuality, because of course no society can tolerate sexual chaos. Every society puts restrictions. Even the communists did that. So the feminists first removed the traditional religious and restrictions on sexuality and on sex, but then they imposed their own far more authoritarian rules and regulations and laws, and they're enforced often at the point of a gun.
And conservatives often underestimate a very powerful feminist message. The personal is the political. The personal is not the political. When we elevate personal issues to the realm of the political, we create a trivial society. And this is one of the reasons why the Me Too movement has become so successful in the West, because the personal is perceived as the political. So a woman interacts with a man and she does not like the interaction, and of course it becomes a political problem. So for example, man spreading. Men are not trained and women don't like how they spread their legs. This is a personal issue because it represents the grievance of one woman, but it is also political because women are eternal victims. And conservatives have underestimated that notion. The personal is the political. The personal is not the political.
That's very true. And that slogan has come under sharp fire, rightly so. Even the great historian Eugene Genovese, who used to be a Stalinist and later became a conservative, he called that slogan totalitarian, and he's right. It is the heart of totalitarianism to refuse to recognize a private, personal sphere of life that is off limits to the state. And that slogan, "The personal is political," implicitly or explicitly denies that there is a private sphere of life that the state cannot enter.
And Stephen, there's also another statement that we must refute: the notion of your truth. There is your experience, but there is no such thing as your truth. So for example, I may have an experience with Stephen that is favorable or unfavorable, but my truth cannot exist, only my experience. My experience is not necessarily the truth.
Right.
So yes, these statements, they sound innocent, but implicitly they're quite powerful. There is no your truth. So for example, Stephen Baskerville is a professor, he has a PhD. That is objective. It cannot be your truth. You don't have a PhD because it is your truth. You have a PhD because you earned it. It's just like talking about gender differences. Stop using the word gender. Just say sex differences. Gender is a social construct created by feminists.
Very true. Yes, this manipulation of language is indeed very dangerous. I agree with you.
And this is one of the reasons why you're publishing for Chronicles magazine, because Chronicles magazine is not afraid to debunk or just destroy mainstream conservatives, because they tend to ignore many salient issues.
That's very true. I think Chronicles magazine is to be commended for taking on these hard issues, because our problems today are oftentimes caused not by the left. The left does what they always do. It's caused oftentimes by the failure of the right, the diffidence and the hesitancy and the fear of conservatives and mainstream people to stand up to dangerous ideologies.
All right, and Stephen, in your book, in chapter 2, there is a subheading: the family and criminality. What are you talking about for persons who are yet to read your book?
Well, again, the one theme of the book is how the sexual revolution and the family law apparatus in particular in the state criminalizes innocent people. And there's many ways it happens. It happens indirectly in the sense that, we know that fatherless children, especially fatherless boys, are very likely to become criminals and to join gangs and to have other social pathological behavior. So it indirectly creates criminality that way. And that's well known. But in my book, I show the other ways in which it creates not just criminality, but criminalization. In other words, it's not just breeding criminals through the single parent homes and the welfare system and the divorce system. It's also criminalizing their parents, the parents of these boys, the fathers especially. So it's both criminality is one result of the sexual revolution, but criminalization is another. It's turning all of us into criminals. That's hardly an exaggeration.
And Stephen, same-sex marriage is now popular. There was a recent poll saying that the majority of Republicans, I believe it was done by Gallup, the majority of Republicans agree with the concept of same-sex marriage, but like you and many other people on the serious right, you don't support same-sex marriage. What are some of your objections to same-sex marriage?
Well, I think the objections to same-sex marriage are, I think they're fairly obvious. But my objection, my view of same-sex marriage, and I've written about this before, is it's in some ways it's more of a symptom than a problem in itself. It's a symptom of how serious the crisis of marriage has become. Because I do believe, and others have said this too, that divorce is far more serious threat to the family and marriage and society than same-sex marriage is. So it's far more destructive. It causes far more social pathologies and criminality and criminalization than same-sex marriage. So same-sex marriage is really more of a symptom. It shows how serious the crisis of marriage has become. And I think the fact that we've allowed it to get that far shows how we've refused to deal with the serious problems. And I think the serious problems are being created more by welfare and by divorce, which we've neglected for decades.
Yes, the divorce is also correlated with instability in the family. The BBC has an excellent article chronicling how breaking up the family can impact children. And Sarah McLanahan, she's cited as a serious writer. So, for example, some people say Black fathers are not really missing. The issue is that Black men don't reside with their children. But I disagree. Human capital formation is best explained by nuclear families. When parents are not in a good space, let's say, for example, the relationship is a bit acrimonious, then despite their spouse, they may neglect the children. So, for example, a woman lives by herself. She's no longer married to her boyfriend, or maybe she's no longer married to her former husband, or maybe her boyfriend is not in the picture. The boyfriend job is to provide, let's say, for instance, $2,000 a month. She's working, she can provide the $2,000 a month. The boyfriend says, I don't have the money, let me borrow, I'm going to borrow a loan, or just wait because I don't have the money. She has the money, but she may refuse to expend resources on her children despite the boyfriend. And studies have been done on the topic. One writer is Neil, he's an economist. And in Jamaica, I've heard several stories of this nature. Women divorce, or they are no longer in relationships with their boyfriends. They have money, but despite the man, the children will end up suffering.
No, absolutely. That's right. That's right. Yes, both the welfare system and the divorce system, which grew out of it, by the way, create these absurd negative incentives, disincentives to healthy behavior. And you're right. It atomizes people. It destroys the family. It causes people, both men and women, to look out for themselves rather than to act as a cohesive family unit for the good of the next generation of the children. It causes people to exhibit selfish behavior, so the children become pawns in a power competition. They become weapons in a legal battle. These are the consequences of state interference in the family. Traditionally, the family, the definition almost of the family, is a realm of governance, a realm of human life where the state doesn't enter. And that's the only way the family can operate, is as a cohesive cooperative unit. But the state comes in, destroys the family, sets the parents against one another, oftentimes sets the parents and the children against one another as well. And then it exploits the situation that it creates. The state officials exploit situations, and they claim to remedy situations, but they've created the problems in the first place. So until we recognize this and reform this, the state is not part of the solution. The state is part of the problem. It is the problem.
Yeah, and why do socialists dislike the family? Because the family is the most individualistic unit in society. Why do we have identities? These identities were first shaped by our parents and other loved ones. So if you annihilate the family, you have destroyed the individual.
That's very true. Yes, the family is a realm that is traditionally off limits to the state. It's the only realm, actually, where people are able to govern themselves and govern one another. It's the only realm in society where anyone has coercive authority over anyone else. In other words, parents have coercive authority over their own children, and that takes priority over the state. So the state doesn't like being excluded from any realm of society. It wants to invade and control everything. And the family is a bastion of private life that the state traditionally couldn't enter. The state does enter it now routinely, and we're seeing the consequences of it.
So, for example, some parents like the outdoors, but if we are not careful when going on an excursion, if our children for even, let's say, 10 minutes are just playing by themselves, then the state can intervene. So the state, in a sense, is also encouraging what we call helicopter parenting. And this robs children of their identities. Children need to play. Yes, they should be supervised, but we need to allow them to play and explore. And if you teach children that their parents must be monitoring them 24/7, then are we creating a permanent underclass of babies? So at 20, 35, people are still depending on their children. So economics can explain why some people are living at home, but I attribute the failure to launch as a consequence of helicopter parenting. So for example, as a young man, people at 25, they were married, they had children. Today at 30, people are not getting married. They still live with their parents and they don't take risk. And it's not because they're busy, their mindset is still like a child. I think this is an interesting point.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. It's difficult to prove, but it makes perfect sense. Absolutely, yes. Parents today are terrified, to leave their children on their own. Not because they're afraid that the children are going to be harmed, but because they're afraid that the state is going to come and take the children away. So you're right. It's absolute madness.
So Stephen, what were you like as a young man, or what were young men like back in your time? Did you take risk? Were you gregarious? What did you guys do?
Well, I think we did to some extent, although I think even in my childhood in the 60s and 70s, this sort of thing was already starting. The fathers you didn't have the out of control divorce rate, but you had the situation where fathers were increasingly weak.
Yes.
Where children were, I think, in many ways coddled. You could see the beginning of it. The divorce rate was growing in the 1960s. Families were increasingly in turmoil. If you go back to a classic piece of literature like Eugene O'Neill's play, The Long Day's Journey into Night, you can sort of see that back. What was that? Back in the 30s, he wrote that. So it's been coming over the years. I mean, you can see it in a work like Zimmerman, Carl Zimmerman's
yes,
book,
The Family and Civilization.
He's been documenting this. He argues that it goes back, to the Renaissance in many ways, and there's some truth in that. I think he makes a case. So it's happened over the course of centuries, but it's greatly accelerated today. In just as you say, in my lifetime, it is accelerated enormously since the. And again, I think things like the no-fault divorce, which started in the 70s, I think has had a huge role, and the welfare system as well, which was expanded so gargantuanly in the 1960s under the Great Society. I think those are the two most, if I had to put my finger on two concrete things, I would say those are the two most important. Other people look at the pill, birth control and so forth, and cultural factors like rock music and pornography and so forth. And there's truth in that. I mean, there is truth in all of that. But I think the two major governmental actions, the concrete actions that are responsible for this are the expansion of the welfare system and the no-fault divorce. And they are the two things that can be remedied. The remedy for that is relatively simple. Changing the culture is a long-term affair. Changing the culture becomes an excuse for doing nothing because it's so difficult to change the culture. But we could remedy the problems of welfare could be reformed. The problems of divorce could be reformed. The Constitution could be enforced, which is really all that is required. And the flagrantly unconstitutional laws like no-fault divorce and the domestic violence laws and the child support system and the welfare system and these kind of things could be the mechanisms for reforming these things are relatively simple. All we need is the political will to do it.
And we also need brave conservatives like yourself. We
need
can't.
Right. We need the conservative. Yeah, we need the commanding heights of the culture. We need conservatives in the media, in the church, in the universities. There aren't many left, but there are some. And those who have control of these institutions need to speak out. Unfortunately, my complaint, as I say in Chronicles magazine, is that even those conservatives who do still control some of these institutions, these commanding heights of our culture, the universities, the church, the media, the law, they're too quiet, they're too diffident, they're too frightened, and they don't speak out forcefully.
Yes, they're milky toast and nebulous.
Milk toast.
Nebbish,
exactly.
Yes, nebbish. But Mark, sorry, and I called you Mark because we're going to refer to Mark Regnerus for a time. So some years ago, we published a study arguing that the outcomes of same-sex parenting are disadvantageous for children. Some dispute his study. I'm not going to break down the study at the present moment, but this is something that we must assess. Even if homosexuals are not encountering discrimination, they're still more likely to succumb to depression. There is a link. Not all homosexuals who are depressed are victims of discrimination. And this is something that we must tackle and examine. And I'm saying this to indicate that if homosexuality is correlated with dysfunctional traits, so for example, the site Gay Dads proudly argues that 50% of homosexual men who are in stable relationships do not oppose polyamory. Polyamory may not be good for children. At the present moment, the evidence is not clear, but historically, monogamous families have been more successful. So if 50% of gay men do not object to polyamorous relationships, and if this is praised by the homosexual community, then this is a problem. And the truth is that promiscuity is celebrated in the homosexual community. So this is an era that we must contend with if we're going to propose gay parenting.
Absolutely, that's very true. Although I would add that the homosexuals reply, and I think, in a sense they're right, that promiscuity didn't begin with homosexuals.
No, obviously it didn't.
It began with the heterosexuals. We started, and we are responsible for the slippery slope. Now that's not a reason, as some homosexual activists say, it's not a reason for not opposing promiscuity. It is a reason for opposing promiscuity by heterosexuals as well as by homosexuals. So we have to accept the responsibility for what we've taken on, and our misbehavior, we the heterosexuals, does not excuse the homosexuals, or vice versa.
Remember, Stephen, men are relative to women. Men are more promiscuous. Both parties prefer long-term relationships, but men have a greater preference for short-term relationships. And homosexual men are only sleeping with men. They're sexually exclusive. So obviously they will be more promiscuous than average. It's just biology and social psychology.
Exactly.
And they celebrate promiscuity. So some may even take their children to gay pride. And this is an era for further research. When we say that we're raising gender neutral children, are we depriving them of their identity?
Absolutely. There's no question about that. Yeah, gender neutrality is a political program. It's an ideological program. It has no basis in reality or biology or it's true. Yes, gender neutrality is, and I talk about this in my books a bit, about gender neutrality and gender equality and androgyny. And in many ways, I think again, this goes back to the sexual revolution, the gender neutrality and gender equality. What this basically allows, it allows mostly affluent people to pick and choose they're allowed, traditionally in our society, both men and women have certain privileges and they have certain responsibilities. And the myth of gender neutrality basically allows people, especially affluent people, to enjoy all of the privileges of both sexes while avoiding the responsibilities of either sex. So it's a way of evading, of acquiring rights without responsibilities. And of
But
course,
there's
that's very unhealthy.
but it is sheer hypocrisy. Some years ago, there was a study saying that bourgeois women were most likely to identify as mostly straight. So upper class people may promote promiscuity, but they get married and have children.
Right. Very
Yeah, so
true.
the upper class people are not practicing, they're not preaching what they practice. Monogamy is linked to savings, long-term economic development. Actually, many scholars do argue that the rise of the West is linked to monogamy. So for example,
Right.
Africans even today are more polygamous, and polygamy is associated with poverty and less investment in childcare, even if the man is wealthy, because he's forced to spread the resources thinly.
Yeah, that's an interesting argument. I think there's some truth in that. Yeah.
Yeah, but I shouldn't be asking this question. Obviously, I know why. Christianity and the family represent the bedrock of Western civilization. Therefore, if one wants to destroy capitalism, attack the church and the family. So identity politics is really an assault on the family and Christianity. Well, it's not published yet, but I have a little piece or a scribble arguing that the real enemy of identity politics is Christianity.
Yes, that's probably true. I would, and you're right. The reason for it, I think, is because of the unique Christian view of the family. All religions, most religions that I know, have something to say about the family, but it's not the same. It's not the same in every religion. They all understand the importance of the family, but they don't always get the precise formula correct. Whereas the Christian view of the family, as I've tried to show in several books, is the one that has created the most prosperous and stable and successful societies in human history.
Yes, and there's also the Christian notion of original sin. Progressives want utopia, but utopias don't exist. And Christianity is asserting that progress is likely, but a utopia is not inevitable. And progressive envision a perfect world. And the Christian theology is more realistic than the progressive alternative. So there are many parallels between, or should I say disparallels between Christianity and the progressive movement. And one writer, Joshua Mitchell, is making similar assertions, but I am laughing that so many of the so-called experts in the arena of identity politics don't write on Christianity. The exception is Mary Eberstadt.
Yeah, that's true. And I think even then, sometimes some of the Christian writers don't go quite as far as they could in looking at the details, because many Christians also bear responsibility for not criticizing and not reforming the institutions of our society that need to be reformed. So yes, Christianity gives us the tools, but we don't always we don't always use those tools the way God intends for us to.
And now we're going to return to your book, but I just had to refer to Christianity. The subsection 3 is titled Criminalizing Sex, the New Gender Crimes. And there's a subheading, Breastfeeding, page 212, Washrooms 214, and more 215. Why is breastfeeding important? What is the relationship between breastfeeding and criminality? What's the link for those who are yet to read your book?
Yeah, that's interesting. That was just a little illustration I made about how the feminist politics work. It's an interesting case study in how it works, and I wouldn't put too much into it. But yes, feminists were championing the importance of breastfeeding. At least they used to. I'm not sure they do anymore, but at one time they did, and I think it's very good. I agree with that completely. The importance of breastfeeding. All the studies I see say that it's extremely important for children. So, the allowing women or permitting, liberalizing the laws and the rules so that women can breastfeed when it's convenient in a public place is, as far as I'm concerned, I have no objection to that. But they don't stop there. The feminists didn't stop there. They wanted to make it a crime to, as they say, interfere with breastfeeding. In other words, if someone makes a comment or says a word who may disapprove of this or may have problems with it, may consider it improper, they can be punished for it under the law. Okay, so again, this is just an illustration of the the way the feminists they promise liberation, but they deliver authoritarianism. On the one hand, liberalizing the law so that breastfeeding is permitted is something many people support, but punishing people who disagree is not a contribution to freedom. It's authoritarian. So we've lost that distinction in our society, that distinction between, if you like, a libertarianism, the freedom, the laws of the freedoms of the Anglo-Saxon world, of the English-speaking world, traditionally are freedoms from the power of the state. But today's radicals they don't stop with freedom from the power of the state. They want to impose authority as a way of supposedly freeing the disadvantaged. So we have to be careful of this. We have to be careful
Yes,
of
yes,
these so-called freedoms, because many times they come with a price, and that price is a growing state power.
yes. So, for example, I'm against rape, you're against rape, most of us are against rape. But though rape is a disaster, it's really evil, we still require trial by jury, by our peers, trial by jury. And feminists have been advocating against jury trials. They argue that jurors succumb to rape myths and they're likely to believe unsavory stories about women, but the evidence is not panning this out. Stephen? Yeah, hello? All right, let me give him a moment.
Hear anything?
Yeah, Stephen?
Yes.
Yeah, I was giving you a moment. Maybe you had a little problem. I was arguing that rape is egregious. We don't appreciate rape. There is no such thing as a rape culture. In most cultures, rapists are condemned, and based on my understanding of the feminist concept of rape culture, what they're describing is actually a ritual. So the steps leading up to rape is not rape culture, that's more of a rape ritual. But this is just for information for readers who are not familiar with the concept. But yes, jurors are important, and even though rape is a grave sin and crime, we still need trial by our peers. And neither do jurors submit to myths about women and rape victims. The evidence is not panning this out. And there's a movement. There's a movement to get rid of trials by jury.
That's right, and there's a movement even to punish in cases where there is consent, where there was clearly voluntary consent by the woman, the man can still be punished. Yes, this is again part of the larger trend which I described in the book of increasingly criminalizing sexuality, criminalizing the relationships between men and women. And this is a good example of that. The feminists are looking for ever wider, and they admit this. They make this very plain. They're looking for ever wider, ever broader definitions of rape so that more and more things can be defined as rape. Most people think they understand the concept of rape. It's pretty clear in most people's mind what it means, but the feminists are trying to expand it constantly. So things that most of us would not consider rape can be the basis of a criminal accusation and even a prosecution. Another example, there's many examples of this that I raised in the book. Another example is sexual harassment. Most people think that sexual harassment involves men in positions of authority using their power as leverage to extract sexual favors from females who are underneath them. But this is not the definition anymore. The definition of sexual harassment has been continually expanding so that any romantic or sexual advance or move by a man against a woman, which the woman does not welcome, can be classed as harassment. For example, even construction workers looking at women on the street is referred to as I think it's visual harassment is the term that is being used. So we think most men think, well, I would never use my position as leverage to to extract sexual favors from a woman. So you think I would never be accused of sexual harassment, but you can be. You can be accused of it for quite innocuous things. Most male college students think I would never rape a woman, so I'll never be accused of rape. But in fact, a rape accusation is very easy to fabricate after the fact, even when it was consensual sex. So, people are lured or lulled into this complacency about these things because they think they understand what these crimes mean. But the crimes are continuously being redefined, expanded, ambiguous in their wording, vague, so that people who think they're innocent are suddenly guilty or guilty in the eyes of the law.
Exactly. Stephen, we live in such a sick world that a man can be accused of harassment because he compliments a woman. But women who compliment men or even touch them inappropriately are not seen as evil people harassing men, because obviously women can do no wrong. I
Yeah,
think that's the
this
hypocrisy.
yes, there's definitely a double standard hypocrisy. But to be fair, there are circumstances where women are accused of these things. In some circumstances, laws or rules or trends which are intended to target men by feminists sometimes target women, including unfeminist women, especially. So it does happen, but I mean, obviously, it's unjust to whomever it happens.
And Stephen, our last point in relation to your book is the globalization of American human rights, what some may rudely refer to as global homo. Give us your opinion. Should the foreign policy of America be linked to political human rights, because there are no rights to sex and sexuality? Having sex is a function of choice, is a right to free choice, but there's not an innate right to sex or feminism or anything like that.
No, that's correct. There's not. Yeah, so that section of the book refers to the fact that the sexual agenda, the sexual revolution, has become a global phenomenon. It has permeated many institutions internationally, especially the foreign policy of the United States or Great Britain or the European Union have become suffused with sexual issues, sexuality. International organizations like the United Nations and others have been bastions of, even NATO has become bastions of sexual radicalism. NATO policy is being used to enforce sexual radicalism. You can see, I saw an interesting example today of an emission from the US Embassy in Kabul just a few months ago about LGBT pride and so forth. So at a time when the country, Afghanistan, was in danger of being overrun by the Taliban and American citizens and their Afghan allies are in serious danger and risk of their lives. The American embassy in Kabul was not concerned about this. It was not becoming involved because they were wasting their time and their resources promoting the sexual agenda of so-called LGBT people. So, this is extremely, it's harmful. Much of the aid programs toward the third world, bilateral aid and multilateral aid from the United Nations, from the United States, from Great Britain, is often tied to sexual radicalism, especially in countries like India. Human rights agendas are increasingly sexualized. Things like sex education programs are infused with political agendas, not just the physical aspects of sexuality, but political, cultural aspects as well are pushed in by these organizations. So it's become the military has become a bastion of sexual radicalism. The U.S. military, the militaries of countries like Britain and Israel have all become, very heavily sexualized. Again, there have been examples in the last few days as Afghanistan was being overrun. People have pointed out that the military was spending their time, discussing critical race theory instead of discussing war strategy.
Yes.
So, and so this is not just a silliness. This is not just unfortunate. It can have serious,
Yes.
grave consequences in terms of people's lives. So, we need to examine this. No, you're right. To answer your
Yeah.
question, sexuality does not belong in foreign policy. It does not belong in international organizations.
Yeah, and CRT has no business in the military. Militaries are created to fight war, and emasculated and demotivated men do not win war. So even though America is a technological superpower, if China and America were to fight a war, more than likely the Chinese will win because the Chinese are not as emasculated as the Americans. But Stephen, I enjoyed our conversation, and at some point we'll speak again. So bye. All
Thank you
right.
very much. It's been a pleasure.